QSO Today, episode 363, George Dominick W4UW. My thanks to Icom America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur callsign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing the ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic that the amateur radio hobby continues to be. The QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo will begin next weekend, August 14th and 15th. Click on the Expo banner in this week's show notes page for more information and how to get registered to be on the platform. George Dominick W4UW focuses on the fundamentals of amateur radio, including antenna design, building HF power amplifiers, and the simple fun of getting on the air. Amateur radio still fascinates George after almost 70 years on the air. W4UW is my QSO Today. W4UW, this is Eric 4Z1UG. Are you there, George?
I'm right here, Eric. Loud and clear. 5 and 9.
5 and 9 on Zoom.
There you go.
Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, needless to say, it's been a long time ago. As a matter of fact, 1952 was the year. I actually got started in ham radio, like so many have, back in with the Boy Scouts, and we built that first crystal-operated radio, and that was, I guess, my introduction. And then a few years later, I had a friend who loaned. He was leaving town for a long while, and he loaned a radio manufacturer's engineer, RME 84 shortwave radio to me. And he said, you take this up to your room and put a wire on the back of it and listen. So back in those days, of course, it was AM and CW, but I listened to a lot of AM and became a shortwave listener like so many others. And that's what turned me on. And then I got started tuning in ham radio operators on 80 meters. And I asked my dad once, there was nobody in my family who were hams, by the way. I asked my dad once who these people were. And I got to the place where I knew exactly where to tune them in. And I got to the place where I was listening to them fairly regularly. As a matter of fact, I began to recognize voices on there. There's some of the same guys that would get in these round tables on 80. Back in those days. Anyway, my dad said, I think they're ham radio operators. Okay, what's that? He said, they talk over the radio and blah, blah, blah. He knew a little bit about it. And he said, I've got a friend. He said, I got a couple friends who are ham radio operators. And he said, we'll go over and visit them. Well, that was the start of everything right there.
George, was the hometown Knoxville like it is now?
Knoxville, Tennessee. Uh-huh. I was born here in Knoxville and spent most of my life right here.
Your father introduced you to a couple of ham radio operators, and what happened after that?
He introduced me to a gentleman named John Stanberry, and his call was W4DPI, Delta Papa Italy. And John was, he was a big-time radio operator to find out. He lived across town. He worked for Collins Radio. He was a commercial AM, FM salesman throughout the Southeast. And he knew Art Collins and they were buddies, and he did well. He sold a lot of stations. Well, John was the type of person that he had a personality. I mean, he was really a, typical salesman. He had a great mind. He could remember anything you ever told him. But nonetheless, he took me under his wing and got me interested. He had a fabulous station over there in his basement. Had a big rack over there, a 2-bay rack with an RCA. Actually, it was a shortwave commercial broadcast transmitter. And I don't know how far you want me to go with this, but he told me, I asked him about it. He said, Oh, he said, I bought that. He said it was it came from a sunken ship. He said, I bought it as surplus. He said they were taking this RCA transmitter down to South America, and the ship went down, and they salvaged the ship, and this transmitter was available. And at that time, he worked for RCA, so he knew all about it. Anyway, he got the thing, and he reworked it, and he got it going. He used it a lot. And then he went to work for Collins after that, but he had some Collins radio equipment there as well.
So was he using that shortwave transmitter? Was he using that in the amateur band, or was he a shortwave broadcaster?
Oh, he was an amateur radio broadcaster.
160 or 80 meters?
Mm-hmm. But his big interest, John's big interest was DXing, and that's I followed suit in that with him. And he did an awful lot of DXing on 20 meters and 80 meters in the band. But
what was the most important lesson you think you learned from John?
To get on the radio and have fun and talk like he did. His QSOs, they weren't 5 and 9, thank you very much. I'd tune him in, as a matter of fact. I listened to him often. He was very active. I'd listen to him on the on 20, and 20 meters was, I think, his favorite band. He had a power pole out there, and he had a Gordon, a MEMS signal squirter and a Gordon rotator, continuously rotating, by the way, fed with open wire line. Keep in mind that this was 52, and he since moved up to Gatlinburg after that when he retired. But I went by his place where he used to live about 4 or 5 years ago, and I saw that old power pole still out there that he had his beam on years and years ago. Anyway, so eventually my friend, he picked up his shortwave radio, and I didn't have a radio anymore, but my dad went out and bought me an S38 Holocrafters. So I continued my listening with that, and then I got busy, and I was 14 years old and got busy and started learning the code. Now, back then, they only had 2 class licenses, Class A, Class B. And John, he was Class A operator. And so you had to learn, I think it was 13 words a minute, maybe. I don't think it was 15. I think it was 13. So I was trying to learn the code, the CW, and I had a study book from Madar RL. And then all of a sudden I started reading about a novice class license that the FCC had introduced. And they gave their first test in I think it was September. No, it was middle of the year, about July of 1951. That's when it was introduced. So that really turned me on because the questions were much simpler, not much involved, nothing near like the Class B study exam. And so I got busy. In December, I passed the exam before the FCC examiners. They came to town 3 or 4 times a year. And you've heard the story, of course, many times, and got the license, got on the air in March, 1st of March. My dad, in the meantime, once I passed the exam, he went out and bought a HQ129X Hammerlin, and that was a very popular radio then, and a Harvey Wells Bandmaster transmitter. And I put up a wire out front, off-center fed wire, single wire, off-center fed, and I got on the radio, and I was big-time broadcasting. And I really enjoyed CW. I found that my code speed went pretty fast, and a few months later, I was able to get the what they had next class up was a technician license. And that was actually the same thing as a Class B license, but didn't have code with it, didn't have CW with it. But I eventually got the CW and got the general class license and operated quite a bit of CW back in those days and thoroughly enjoyed it. And out of all the 3 CW exams that I've taken over the years, I never failed one.
Can we go back just a second? You're the first guy that I've spoken to, the first ham, that actually had a single wire center fed antenna. So essentially that's kind of like a long wire that takes off in 2 directions up high, right?
Well, it was only about 20 feet high, it one end tied on one of my neighbors on one side to a tree, and then my neighbor on the other side tied to a persimmon tree or something up there, and it was about 25 feet high. And it was a single wire, and then off center fed there was another single wire that came back to my transmitter.
But you then had a counterpoise or something like that, another wire thrown out the window or something like that, or?
No, it was just an off center fed wire.
No coax.
No, coax.
Obviously no twin lead.
Yeah, coax was fairly new at the time. I think it was introduced during the war, World War II.
Right. But that single wire antenna reminds me of what you might see on a schooner, where you've got two masts, the wire between the two masts, and the single wire coming down to the radio operator's transmitter.
That worked fine because my Harvey Wells Bandmaster transmitter, it only had one ceramic terminal on the back.
Oh, okay, with the big LC tank circuit on the back, right?
Yeah, and then there was no, the SWR might have been who knows what, because we didn't have SWR meters. I don't think back in those days. At least I didn't have one. And you just got on the air and put a ground lead to your transmitter, and away that was your counterpoise, I suppose. I went to my hot water radiator in my room, and that was it. And so I guess must have had a little bit of a signal because I had a lot of QSOs. And from there, upgraded my license and started when I graduated from from high school. My parents, they bought me a Collins 75A3 receiver. Hell, that was big time.
That was a big time.
Yes, and I had that through college, I believe, and eventually I went through an awful lot of equipment over the years. There's been a lot of transmitters and receivers to go across my operating desk.
So can I ask a question there, George? It seems to me that you're smitten with amateur radio bug as a teenager. Did ham radio play a part then in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
How did that play out? Did you end up going to university to learn engineering?
Okay. So once I graduated from high school, of course, I went to the University of Tennessee, which was here in Knoxville, and got the idea that maybe electrical engineering was the discipline for me. But I got in there and didn't spend enough time with it. I guess I was working with my ham radio too much, and anyway, I shifted over to sales. Marketing, and that's what I ended up graduating with, and that's where my career actually took me, because once I graduated from the University of Tennessee, I went to work for Gray Bar Electric, which was worked for them for 5 years. They were electric, and I liked that work there. But then opportunity came along at one of the radio distributors in Knoxville. So I made the change and went over and got into electronic sales. And that's where they started with industrial electronic sales. That was quite young at the time, and there wasn't all that much electronics out there. But I really enjoyed it, and that's what I stayed with. And that was back in 50, I graduated in 58, and so my job started soon thereafter with Gray Bar, and for 5 years, and then industrial electronics, and a company that, like I said, was in that business, and so we called on industry.
You were selling equipment to other businesses, like Gray Bar Electric, for example. I used to buy from them. You could buy any kind of electrical, or I used to buy telephone systems from Gray Bar Electric.
Well, Gray Bar was actually initially was an arm of Western Electric.
Okay, that's why you could buy phone systems from them.
That was their distributor arm, because they made telephones, and Gray Bar sold the telephones, and from there they expanded out into the electrical field. And then eventually they totally were out on their own as an independent company. And it was a stock-owned company by the employees. I remember when I left the company, I had to sell the stock back. I'd say it was a good company.
And now this message from Icom America. Icom has the base station of your dreams with the IC7851, the IC7610, the IC9700, and the IC7300 SDR transceivers. Icom's transceivers are top of the line and are the first choice of contesters across the globe. Robust base stations like these cut through the pileups, letting you work the bands and record those contacts. Keep up your competitive contesting edge with Icom. You've heard it, worked it, logged it. The Icom IC7851 gives you a new window into the RF world, and with faster processors, high input gain, high display resolution, and a cleaner signal, it is truly the pinnacle of HF perfection. It includes dual receivers, digital IF filters, memory keyer, digital voice recorder, high-resolution spectrum waterfall display, enhanced PC connectivity, and an SD memory card slot. The IC7610 is the SDR wanted by every ham. This high-performance SDR can pick out the faintest of signals even in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The Icom IC7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio that will change the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. RF direct sampling system, 110 dB RMDR, independent dual receiver, dual digicell. Create your own band opening with the Icom IC9700. This transceiver brings you direct sampling to the UHF-VHF weak signal world. This all-mode transceiver is loaded with innovative features that are sure to keep you busy. Faster processors, higher input gain, higher display resolution, and a cleaner signal. It has a 4.3-inch touchscreen color TFT LCD, real-time high-speed spectrum scope and waterfall display, smooth satellite operation with 99 satellite channels, dual watch operation, and full duplex in satellite mode. The IC7300 changed the way that entry-level HF is designed. This high-performance innovative HF transceiver has a compact design that will far exceed your expectations. Again, it has RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, and an SD memory card slot. Go to icomamerica.com/amateur to find the Icom dealer nearest you. And when you buy that super Icom rig, tell the dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. So where did you spend the most of your time in your career then? You stayed in Tennessee. What companies did you work for?
Well, I worked for a local company. Once I left Graybar, there was a local company owned, by some gentlemen who they could see that the industrial electronics business was something that was in the future. Now they were a distributor for TVs. You know, TV came to town in 1952 or 3 or 4, something like that, and back in those days, this company that I worked for, they had a warehouse. They had boxcars lined up behind their business at a track back there. They'd unload those boxcars full of console TVs, and then they'd ship them out all over East Tennessee primarily. Now, that was not the only business. Of course, when they were in that business, that meant they had to carry replacement parts, and then replacement parts carried over into RCA and other parts. And they said, well, let's see, this industrial business industry, they're using a lot of wire and cable and all kinds of miscellaneous stuff. So that's where I got in and called on a lot of the anything from you name it. I worked primarily, though, through the years. My primary customer was the Tennessee Valley Authority, and they were the manufacturer of power here in the area. They built dams and operated nuclear power plants and coal-fired power plants, and it's like a lot of businesses. Once you understand how they like to do business, and if you can mold your way of selling them into the way they like to buy, and you can do well. So I enjoyed that. And then after so many years, I left and I went to work for another company. The name of it was Industrial Electronics, and it was a young company. It was a startup company. There were six there, and I was number 7. And I worked for that company for quite a while. And now that company has over, they've got 60 or 70 employees, and they're really big time. Anyway, I retired when I was 69 years old, and I would have worked longer had I been younger. So
I hear that, yeah.
I knew it was time for me to be able to spend a little bit more time on the radio. And at times, I would go to work in the mornings at 9 o'clock. Hey, they let me come to work at 9 o'clock so I could be on the bands and get those early morning openings. And it was amazing. I've been through so many sunspot cycles. And I remember that oftentimes those mornings on the 20-meter band, I could point the antenna south and work long path into Asia, big time bad. And I had so many also friends in Australia. And I've got recordings from the Khyber Pass in Afghanistan, and of course all over Africa. That was a colonial country, many Europeans and Americans were all over Africa, with all those countries, more countries in Africa than any other continent, and in the Middle East, and I was talking to anybody. I was talking to everywhere. It was amazing. It was a day in, day out thing. I made a lot of good friends, and oftentimes, of course, I'd be talking to the same people. Well, I got to know some Australians pretty well, and my friend John, my Elmer, he knew some Australians, and so between the two of us, there was a common denominator there with a gentleman named Neville Stillwell, BK3 Alpha Charlie November. And so Neville, he said, I'd like to come and visit you guys. Well, yeah, come on over. Stay with us. Yeah, you can do it. And he made a trip over and brought his daughter with him. And we had a good time while he was here. And so some years later, he brought his wife with him for a second visit, big time. Now, he said it was time for us to make a trip over there. So my son, he was 12 years old, and he had gotten his novice license. And when he was 14, he got his extra class. That meant that he had to do the 20 words a minute, CW. And he had no trouble with it. He was a big-time CW operator. So Marshall is his name. And so Neville says, Marshall, he says, you come with your dad, and we're going to do some interesting things. He said, where would you like to go in Australia? And Marshall says, where do most people go in Australia? Oh, he said, most people go up along the Gold Coast, along the eastern shore. Well, he said, where do the least number of people go? And he said, oh, well, probably up to the interior of the country. And he said, that's where I want to go. And he said, well, okay, that's what we'll make our plans to do. So I was in conversation with another gentleman down in Adelaide, and as it turns out, we flew down and stayed with Neville, and then we got in his caravan, I call it a trailer, and he had a 14-foot trailer and a Land Rover, I believe. And then we went down and picked up the gentleman down in Adelaide and his wife, who had a caravan, and we headed north. And we stopped, I stopped off at so many. I could tell you, we stopped at Cooper. Have you ever heard of a place by the name of Cooper Pedy? There's so many of these Aboriginal names down there that you can't even. I wouldn't even know how to read them. Seeing them on signs, I couldn't make sense out of them. But we stopped at Cooper Pedy. That's where they mine opals. That's a big mining area. So we got some opals. That was my souvenirs or whatever it is to bring back to my wife and my mother and the people live. A lot of people live underground there. It gets so hot. But anyway, we went on up to Ayers Rock, and
I'm just curious. Did you make this trip during the Australian summer?
Yes, because it was, to keep in mind now, let's see, it was in September, so it was autumn, I mean, the seasons are just reversed, as you know.
Right. So it's becoming the spring there in Australia, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So if we went down there, let's see, I don't remember exactly what month it was, but I think it was more in the fall, which would match spring down there. And so it was getting pretty warm, and I remember we finally put our shorts on when we got up there halfway, and we went on up to, we stopped off at Ayers Rock. Have you ever heard of that place?
Mm-hmm.
It's a monolith, and it's a couple thousand feet high. It's a big rock, and we got up and we climbed that sucker. And they don't let you do that anymore. It's, number one, it's too dangerous, and number two, it's in the Aboriginal country there that they blocked off. And in Australia, Aboriginals, they stay more or less in the center of the country, and in some areas you have to get a license to go into the area. They leave the Aboriginals alone. They say, you've been here for a million years, we're not going to bother you. And so, of course, most people
makes sense.
Yeah, most people in Australia live around the edge of Australia, as you well know. The population is there.
On the coast rather than in the interior, right?
That's right, sure. West Coast, East Coast, South. We went on up to Alice Springs. You ever heard of Alice Springs? That's in the dead center of Australia. And I figured and we went through a lot of little old, I call them a two-horse count. I mean, they didn't really much. There wasn't anything there. They call them towns, but there really wasn't any, like a river, when we were riding along Melville, he'd say, where do you think we are now? And I'd say, well, according to the map here, we hadn't gotten to the river yet. Oh, he said, we passed that river 20 miles, way back. I said, no, we didn't. He said, yes, we did. It didn't have any water in it, but there was a river there. And they have a lot of, it's very, very arid, dry out there.
Were you operating amateur radio in the middle of Australia?
Oh, yeah, we had Mobile. We had Mobile there. And Marshall, he worked a lot of CW. And he said he never, it's that north-south trans-equatorial into Japan from down there. And he said he'd just have so many Japanese stations calling him on CW. He took his key down there, and I can see him now sitting in the front of that Land Rover working that key, talking to Japanese stations. But anyway, yeah, like a lot of fun. A big, climbing and doing and what we did, and got to Alice Springs, and I thought it was just going to be another little small village town out there, but it turned out to be a pretty good sized city. You even had a Kmart in there, and I think it was an interesting place.
Well, you were ready for Kmart by the time you got to Alice Springs, I would think, right?
I guess we were, and then we ventured out from there. We stayed there for about 3 or 4 days, and we took a lot of hikes out into various places, Palm Valley. We'd drive out 30, 40, 50 miles in different interesting places. And then we made our trip back on some, what they call tracks. And, Eric, we'd travel all day and we'd see maybe 3 cars, going by. And, we were really out there. And oftentimes what happens when you get out there in that area, and if you get into if it starts raining, and sometimes it does, certain times of the year, certain times of the year they get the rain, but if you get out there and during that period of time, you may be stranded for a week because of floods. You may just be on a little island out there.
You want to be on the high ground.
Yeah. Stay with the high ground, but we didn't see any rain, but we traveled for days and saw very, very few people. That was fascinating to me.
So let me ask you something, George. Would you recommend this trip to other amateurs? If you look at what you did with your son and amateur radio friends, would you recommend a trip to the Outback?
Eric, I've traveled a good bit around different places. I haven't been around the world, but I've been to Europe and Central America and up through Canada primarily. But the thing is, if you know somebody, and that's where amateur radio comes in. You get to talking to somebody, and you get to talking to them often, and you get to know them, then that might be an opportunity for you to go visit them or for them to come visit you. And the hams that I have visited with on amateur radio and who I have had the pleasure of meeting in person, I was never disappointed. They were the same people that I talked to on the radio. And we got along very well. We had so much fun together. And so Neville, he lived in a place by the name of Bendigo, which was a gold mine area of Australia. So, I mean, we did a lot of things. Went down in gold mine, 1,000 feet in the ground.
It sounds absolutely wonderful.
It was.
Let me take a quick break to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, and that's the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Jeremy, KF7IJZ, and it now includes Michael Walker, VA3MW, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. The group documents their projects and makes circuit boards available to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Jeremy may complain about the overall length of the podcast, but friends, let me tell you that I could listen to it all day, and that's good. Even if you are a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George, Jeremy, and Mike now for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast on every podcast player. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. So let's change directions just a little bit. I agree with you, by the way, that traveling to other hams is a great thing. I've been very lucky to have some listeners of the QSO Today podcast come to Jerusalem. I shared a nice meal together, and that's always a tremendous thing. What's interesting, at least here, is that when they come here, they're usually on tours. They haven't really experienced a tour until they've come to Israel because they're so exhausted by the time they've spent 14 days here that they actually have to go home and probably rest another week because you're moving all the time. So let's depart from that a little bit. What is your favorite operating mode? My sense is that you like just about everything, but do you have a favorite operating mode?
I do. But let me regress just 1 second, please, about travel. When I was in college, my sister was she left college and got her a job as an airline. They call them hostesses back in those days. Today they're what do you call them?
Flight attendants.
Yeah, flight attendant, right. Anyway, she would get me free passes on this large airlines that she worked for that said from anywhere to anywhere. Well, my parents didn't travel much, and she would pass these passes off to me. I'd jump on the plane over the weekend, fly up to New York City. It was a one hop from Knoxville to New York. And I had a place to stay up there through a fraternity. And I went down to, you ever heard of a place up in by the name of Radio Row in New York City? That was back before they built the towers there, the Twin Towers. And I'd go down there, and I'd go to Harrison Radio. I'd go to Lafayette Radio, and you name them up there. They were all over the place. And that's where I spent my time going and looking at amateur radio stuff. I made several trips up there. And that Radio Row, that was something else down there with all the World War II surplus equipment that was available. And that, of course, is what put so many hams on, novices back in those days. You could buy BC 340, a transmitter and get it on the band and operating as a novice easily. So I went up there, I don't know how many times with a free pass. And I got to travel around different other places, too, doing the same thing.
Have you done some personal DXpeditions with these passes? Take equipment to exotic location to work DX?
No, I have not. Talked to many of them though. I've talked to a lot of them. My favorite mode. Now let's go back. My favorite mode was originally CW, but then I left it and I got into phone, and it's been phone ever since. And I really enjoyed. I got on the single sideband using an HT32 Hammerlin, Holocrafters. Got that sometime after, I don't know, 56. I got on sideband and probably around 50, 56, 57. I think there was at least 30% of guys on sideband then. It was really coming in big time fast at that point. And my HT32 and my 75A3, that's what I used for quite a while. And once I started working, I worked part time and I was trading equipment. Back in those days, you could trade in one piece of equipment and get another piece of equipment, a new piece, and start paying on it every month. I mean, it was amazing. Everybody had credit back in those days.
You sent me some pictures, and if you look at your QRZ page, you're sitting at a very nice modern rig with a waterfall display, but you have a rack of equipment behind you. What is that rack of equipment, and is that something that you built? Because it doesn't appear to have any labels on it.
Well, I got interested in building, and my first building amplifiers primarily. And back in in the middle 50s, I bought a Barker & Williamson transmitter, an amplifier, had a pair of 813s in it, 813 Tetrodes, and that was my first amplifier. And I got interested from that, I got interested in doing some building, and the next thing I built was a power supply for it. Somebody had told me you need to raise the voltage on those 813s to get a little bit more power out. Well, I built up a power supply that by all rights, I probably shouldn't be sitting here today dealing with 3,000 volts back in those days, but I survived, and those 813s didn't last very long with the kind of voltage I was putting on them. But back in those days, you could buy them for surplus, for a couple of dollars a piece. So just buy them in a 6-pack, and a couple of them goes out, reach down, grab 2 more, and put in. And that went on for a while. And then I changed that over to a pair of 400As, and one thing led to another. And I still have that same amplifier now. It's got a roller inductor in it. It's got a pair of 3500Zs that are over 50 years old. Paid $35 brand new a piece for them.
You turn the voltage down a little bit, right?
Well, the 3500s, they take about 3,000 volts. So that worked fine. But those tubes, I've got a pair of them that I still use today. They're over 50 years old. And I bought those brand new for $35. That was the introduction price of a brand new tube when they introduced them. And then I got into 4-1000As. One of my customers was a radio station, and there were some hams around the radio stations that I used to call on. And he said, we got these pulls that we take out. We replace these tubes every so many hours. And he said, they're great tubes. And he said, let me give you several of them. And he did. And he built an amplifier. Well, that was a great tube. I don't know if you know what a 4-1000A looks like. Maybe you do. And it's of course, I'd already had the 400As in an amplifier. So I built up an amplifier using the 41000, and I built it as I think that was the first one. But yes, I built it as a monoband amplifier for 20 meters because I was active on 20. I had a 3-element Telrex beam. You know the name Telrex? Does that mean anything? It's an old-time, excellent quality antenna, very heavy, and that's the only antenna I had when I moved here to this location 50 years ago. And I stayed on 20 meters pretty much all the time. And this 4-1000A amplifier turned out to be, I don't know, I must have gotten lucky on it, but I call it a 724 amplifier. It'll operate 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. And I still use it. I still have it. Now, that amplifier, that particular one is in that rack that's in a photograph that you have. There's two amplifiers in that rack. The other amplifier is that I built a little bit later. I got on 160, and I built a 4-1000A for 160, 80, and 40, those 3 bands. And I put a window in the front of it so you could look in there and see the plate of the tube. And that was one thing I never could understand, why more manufacturers of amplifiers didn't put a window in the front of their amplifier so you could really see the plate, bloom with color when you talk into it. But any rate, that was a 160. I've since sold that amplifier, and then I built another one that had a 3-1000A. My Elmer, he gave me this amplifier that he had built with a 3-1000A in it, and he had some problems with it, and it had vacuum variables in it, and Tom found out one of the vacuum variables had leaked and wasn't any good. Well, he just said, "Here, take it away," and I rebuilt it, and that amplifier that, I'll come to think of it, I know what that was. The amplifier that he gave me was a water-cooled tube. It had a 3CX 1500, something like a 8877, but it had a water-cooled jacket on it. And he'd been using that for quite a while. Well, it stopped working, and he had trouble with it. So that's the one he passed along to me, and that's the one I rebuilt and put 3500 in it, or 3-1000 in it. And I sold it too. Some guy really wanted it bad, and I kept telling him it wasn't for sale. One day he came along and he said, "Well, George," he said, "if it was for sale, how much would you want for it?" And I gave him some big price of $850, He said, "Well, if you'll sell it to me for $850, I'll be up there tomorrow with the cash and I'll buy it from you." Well, I thought real fast, well, $850, I could do a lot with it. So I said, "Well, come on up."
So, George, did you build anything else? Does your bench have other projects? Did you restore equipment?
The only other building was beam. I built beam antennas. I built several beam. In fact, I've got one up right now that I use on 17. 17 meters has been my favorite band for the last number of years, and I use it in conjunction with a TH11. I have a 100-foot tower, and the TH11's at about 31 meters. And the 4-element 17 Yagi, it is at about 21 meters on the tower, and these operate in phase in what they call a stacked array. And 17 meters has been my favorite band for the last while, and works real good. I enjoy using them, and they work well, but I've also spent time on 20 meters and the other bands as well. Not much so much. I talked to my son on 80 meters. That's about the only time I get on 80. But he's an FT8 operator. My son Marshall, my son I was telling you about, went to Australia. He's very, very active on FT8. His call is by the way, my original call that was issued to me was of course it goes back to the WN for UWC. And, of course, once you get your technician license, you drop the N. That's a permanent license. Initially, that novice license was only good for a year, and then you lost it. But you had to upgrade. So I had W4UWC for years. And when Marshall, he worked for, when he graduated in engineering from the university, went to work for a large company up in Lexington, Kentucky, and they sent him around the world. His expertise was laser cartridges, the manufacturing thereof. And he was in China, and they had factories in China and down in Mexico, and I think they were going to put one over, and they had one down in Brazil. Anyway, he was he dealt with manufacturing of laser cartridges, for laser printers.
But you were saying that he likes to operate FT8.
Yes, that's right.
And he talks to you on single sideband on 80, and that's like the only time that you get on 80? You're not up late at night talking on 80 with the roundtables?
No, not me. I'm not a roundtable guy, and I'll tell you why. My hearing is not as good as it used to be. In my later years, I classify. I was talking to somebody about this not long ago. The conversational audio that you use, and I call it conversational audio that you use down on 80 and 40 in roundtables, I don't hear that well. But now I call, when you get up into the 20 meters and up, then you get into DX audio, which has got a lot more highs cranked into it, and I can hear that fine.
It's interesting because I think what the guys that are usually running 80, they might even be running AM down there on 80. It's very hi-fi, but it has a full spectrum of audio, right? Maybe even bassy.
I call it conversational audio, and I can appreciate that. And then, but if you use conversational audio on the DX bands, you're going to be missing a lot of DX because they can't hear you. You're gonna blend right into the noise.
What else is in the ham shack? What's the premier radio at the moment in your ham shack?
Most recently, I got an FTDX 101 D. That's a wonderful radio. I got an IC 7300 like everybody else has back about a couple year or so ago. I gave that to my son, and that's what he uses on FT8. And that was my introduction to a band scope. And I decided that I had to have a receiver that had a band scope on it. And being a Yaesu guy, I guess that made me really think serious about the 101, which I got, and I've discovered that I did not make a mistake. I like that radio. I like using a mouse with it. I can change anything I want to on a large monitor screen. But anyway, and it hears well. I like the radio, and it drives my amplifiers real well too. And prior to that, I've had a lot of equipment, as I mentioned to you earlier.
You're a big DXer. It's obvious from your QSO page. And you belong to a number of DX clubs. How important are DX clubs to DXers?
Well, DX clubs are one of the things that a friend of mine, W4 November Lima, and his wife and myself, we got together and started the Southeastern DX Contester and SEDCO, they call it, SEDCO, contesting organization, contesting DX and contesting organization. That was 15 years ago. And the first year we had about 75 people to attend it at a motel up in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. That's up near the Smoky Mountains. And it continued to grow. And after a few years, after 10 years, we picked up the name W4DXCC convention, and it's drawn up to 250 or so folks, hams from all over the country, from California to New York to Florida. And one of the reasons I think they like to come there is because they can bring their wives, and their wives like to do shopping up there in Pigeon Forge, and there's a lot of things to do up there. It's going to be held again. We've since turned it over to Dave Anderson, W4 or K4 Sugar Victor. He's running it now. And Lynn, my friend Lynn, he passed away, unfortunately, not too long ago. But Dave's doing a good job with it, and they're taking reservations now, and I think the motel's already booked up, and we'll probably have another 200 and so up there in attendance. And that's been a great I think these gatherings are just what they are. They're friendly. You meet a lot of nice folks, just like you do on the air. And another thing is that you get to meet in person some of these DXers that you hear on the bands often, in the pileup, so to speak. You hear a lot of guys calling, and it's nice to meet some of these gentlemen in person. I used to attend DX conventions up in the Washington, D.C. area, down in Atlanta. And over in Charlotte, North Carolina, a lot of, you get to know it. I think it's knowing your fellow hams that really makes the hobby that much more interesting.
It sounds like it. George, let me ask, what would you advise a new ham if he wanted to become a successful DXer?
Well, unfortunately, there's a lot of hams who never get on the air. They get their license, but that's about it, and that's unfortunate too. My thinking is, and I've just recently, Eric, I've started working 10 meters. 10 meters has opened up. The bands, we're going into this cycle 25. The bands are looking up now. technician class operators have a portion of the 10-meter band, 28.2 to 28.5, I think, 28.3, 25. Anyway, down the low end of 10-meter phone. So technicians can get on, and now with 10 meters picking up now, it's really interesting. I try to make it a point to see if I can talk to technicians down there, try to encourage them, to move ahead and have fun and enjoy the hobby. But there's so many who don't ever get on the air once they get their license, and that's unfortunate.
Well, it seems that at 10 meters for a new ham, the antenna is not big, right? It'll fit on a city lot.
That's correct.
And there's some real chances with a band opening to kind of work worldwide on 10 meters, so it could be quite exciting.
Well, this is something that a new ham has to learn, Keep in mind that new hams get on the air. They don't know a lot of this stuff, and they have to hear it from people like ourselves who have been on the air for a while. And so it's up to us to, of course, encourage them to move along and enjoy the band, and try to tell them a little bit about what's in store for them, because they don't know anything about a good opening on 10 meters, I'm old enough that I've been on the band years ago when 10 meters was, well, you've heard or maybe you haven't. Have you ever heard the old saying that you can work the world on 10 meters with a wet string?
Sure. If the band conditions are right, sure.
Exactly. And 10 meters can get good, and it'll be good again as we get further into this 25 cycle, and I think that's going to help cultivate some new hams too, being able to get on the band.
If they're operating single sideband on 10, then that means that even some pretty old radios that are available for $100, $200 would get them on the air with a lot of satisfaction.
You're right. But I find that, and there's lots of nice radios out there that are 10 years old that you can buy for $300, say $350, some old models. And they work just as great. They work as great as any new radio. They sound as good. But new hams, they want new equipment. I don't know. They don't seem to want to. They want to spend a lot of money, and more power to them, as I say. But that's all part of it.
What do you think that the greatest challenge is to amateur radio now?
There's a lot of things. That's a loaded question, actually.
I ask loaded questions every once in a while. But that's one I ask all the time, because I'm interested in what you think the biggest challenge is facing amateur radio now from your perspective.
There's there's many challenges that come into play here, and I think we've heard lots of them. One of them is lack of activity. That's probably the big thing. I think there's so many hams that are just not very active, and I find that, well, as an example, I find that with this band scope on this 101, I can look at the band, and I think oftentimes what happens with a lot of folks, they turn their transceivers on, they look at the band scope, and they see nothing. However, there is one white mark down on the low end, and that white mark is FT8 activity. And that FT8 activity is there, and it's there on all bands, and all anybody has to do is look at that, and they can tell by the height how strong the signals are, and they should, in my opinion, go up, and if they don't see any signals on single sideband, and that's oftentimes the case, and it's unfortunate, they look at the band scope, they don't see anything, they move on, and they use that word dead. Oh, the band's dead. Well, it's not dead. It's not dead because you can see that there's activity down on FT8. So why don't you get up here and call CQ? And that's another thing. I find that for every one CQer, one individual ham that's willing to get on and call CQ, there must be a dozen out there who don't. I have some friends who never call CQ. And I don't know why people, other hams, I do not understand why hams don't call CQ. I don't know. Beyond me, but they'd rather just tune the band and hear somebody else call CQ and call them. And I don't like to use that word so much, but it's just, you get on the band and have one CQ or put out a CQ, and you might find that 2 or 3 people call you.
Since I started this podcast in 2014, I think I've spoken to probably half a dozen hams that have said the same thing that you're saying, and that is just because the band appears to be dead, it's because everybody is listening and waiting for somebody to send CQ so they can answer. So I've heard this advice before that just get on there and send CQ and somebody will come back to you. If the band's really dead, it might be your neighbor on ground wave, but it will be somebody.
One of the things that my Elmer taught me, John, he said, just remember one thing, George. He said, nobody's going to hear anything if nobody transmits.
Right, he's right about that, yeah.
That's always stuck with me. Don't be afraid to call CQ. But at any rate, I think there's a lack of activity. That's certainly a challenge. Age, general age of amateurs, that comes into play.
Before I pushed the record button, you and I were having a little conversation, and we were talking about who listens to the QSO Today podcast. And you gave me an amazing idea in terms of, you said to me, Eric, well, what if people, non-hams, were listening to the podcast? And so the idea that you gave is that as a community, we don't advertise outside of the community. So we're not advertising in the ARP magazine or in Reader's Digest, as you mentioned. What advice would you give to the leaders of our community in terms of how they might get the word out?
Well, I frankly, I've never heard anybody talking about advertising outside of ham radio magazines. But I think maybe that's a new thought. I think it's time that we let the world know something about amateur radio and spend the money and do that advertising and then let people see those ads in those magazines and introduce ham radio to an awful lot of people that need ham radio introduced to, if you follow me.
As you said earlier, before we started, that oftentimes people ask you, do you reply that you're an amateur radio operator, and they kind of have this puzzled look like, either what's amateur radio or I remember that from 40 years ago. Do people still do amateur radio? What comes to mind is that a lot of people that make big decisions about, one, whether we have more spectrum or keep the spectrum we have or allow antennas in HOA communities or are responsible for zoning of residential neighborhoods for towers and stuff, all these people may not know anything about amateur radio. So perhaps we owe it to ourselves and to our hobby to maybe extend this knowledge to people who thought that amateur radio operators were something of the distant past.
Well, it's almost, Eric, it's almost like we want to keep this to ourselves. This is such a wonderful hobby, and we enjoy it so much, this amateur radio community. Don't tell anybody about it, no. We got to get away and let the world know about amateur radio and let other people everywhere enjoy it. And it's not just here. It's all over the world, I guess. And I don't know really how it works in other parts of the world. But speaking for this country, I think there's a wonderful opportunity to get out and let the world, everybody that we can know about amateur radio. It just makes sense to me.
Let's flip the question. What excites you the most about amateur radio from your long perspective?
What excites me is the same thing excited me 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Talking to other hams, and I just enjoy talking to other people and learning about them and asking questions. And there's a lot of hams on the air that'll talk to you, but they won't talk to you very long. It's, it's just you're 5 and 9, good signal, nice day here. And I hope we'll meet up again sometime. Well, if you start asking a ham a question, he likes to talk about what he's been doing. And most of the time you can have a nice long QSO by asking a question or two. Oh, something came to mind. I received an email just yesterday from a gentleman up in, I think he was up in Maine, and I'd had a contact with him on 623. He reminded me, he said I was QRP using a KX3, and he said I had a wire thrown up in the tree, and we had a contact that lasted a half an hour while I was out here on a park bench using a solar cell. And then he said, but the thing that I'm really excited about was that I've been a ham since 02. And he said, I decided I was going to convert all my paper logs to digital. So he said, I got them out and I started with my first QSO. He said, would you guess who was my first QSO? He said, it was you. He said, we had almost 20 years to the day, we had a QSO, and you were my first QSO on the air. And he said it lasted 18 minutes, and here we've had another one today. He said, I just had to tell you that. I thought that was interesting.
So hopefully he'll stay on his paper logs. It's funny, over the last few conversations that I've had in the last month or so, paper logs keeps coming up as an idea. And maybe it's for that same thing, as you have the ability to thumb through it and see what happened before. Well, that's very exciting. I don't say this very often to the QSO Today podcast audience, but over half the people that I invite who say yes to being guests on the QSO Today podcast always tell me that they don't think that they can talk for an hour to me on the podcast. And I'm always happily surprised. I'm not a surprise anymore, but they're happily surprised that, in fact, they have the ability to have a QSO and talk for an hour. What advice would you give to new or returning hams, George?
My advice would be to, here again, get on the air and have fun. And you can't really enjoy ham radio unless you do get on the air, number one. And once you get on the air, you're going to find really what excites you most. I used to believe that these tests they're given today's are too simple. They're this, they're that. No more CW required. Well, I changed my mind. I've decided that a new ham needs to pass the examination, become a new ham, get on the air, and then find your point of interest once you're on the air. You might end up in FTH. You might end up with doing anything, building, using this, that, or whatnot, another modes. There's just so many possibilities.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think what's also interesting is that I think the number of CW operators in the world is now higher than it was before when the CW requirement was required.
I talked to a ham not long ago. He passed an exam, and it was a no-code exam. And he says, I'm learning the code. He said, I'm going to be a CW operator. That follows suit with just exactly what you said. There is interest in CW.
I just took the CW Academy course. I think I'm going to take the intermediate course in another, 6 weeks or so. It's full. To get into CW Academy, you have to actually wait 6 months or so because there's so many people that want to be in it. So I think that there's this renaissance of CW operation that is here now, and people like it from the standpoint of it's different. Maybe it's more relaxing after a long day hitting the keyboard for your job. So I think that may also be part of the allure of some of these old-time modes.
You know what I'm doing now, Eric? I told you that I used to operate out of CW. I mentioned that earlier. And I find that I'm going down on the W1AW code practice frequency, and I go down there and copy CW. And I've got my code speed up to a good solid 15, and I'm getting about 75% of 20 words a minute now. I think it's fun. It's a challenge, just a personal challenge. I can't seem to send it. I've got some arthritis in my fingers or something, and I can't send CW like I used to. And that's one of the reasons, I guess, that I sort of got away from CW. I don't know what it was, but I'm enjoying getting my code speed back up again. But it's fascinating to me to think about a CW operator who can send CW at 30, 35, 40 words a minute. And it's nothing more than a foreign language, and you're copying words. You're no longer copying letters. It's fascinating. Of course, I'll never get there, but it's simply just another language.
Well, George, I am so grateful that you got to this point so that you could talk to me on the QSO Today podcast. I've really enjoyed the interview and the QSO that we've had, and I hope to work you at some point when I get myself on single sideband or maybe on CW at 15 words a minute, and I'll see you in the log, as they say. With that, I want to thank you so much. Wish you 73. Thank you for coming on.
Well, I thank you for the opportunity, Eric, and what you're doing is certainly a worthwhile project, and I commend you for it. So keep on keeping on, and hopefully we'll meet up again one day. 73 to you, and the best of luck, Eric. Shalom.
Shalom, 73. Thanks so much. That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with George. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in W4UW in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to click on the Expo menu item at the top of the page or at the banner in the middle of the page for updates on next week's QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. I'm updating it as I have more information, and by the way, we have over 90 speakers in our auditorium this time. My thanks to Icom America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of Icom America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart, Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn. My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.